What's going on, guys? It's Salted Neos here. For the last couple of weeks, I've been researching how shiny Pokemon work in a set of the more obscure Pokemon games, the WiiWare Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games. And with a little bit of effort, I've managed to implement most of the missing shiny Pokemon in the game. The link to the patches are in the description below. If you're here just for the mod, beware that there are currently a couple of technical limitations that need to be addressed, which will be addressed in either its README or later in this video. If you want more information on how shinies work in this game and how to ensure you will recruit one if you see one, check out this video on screen after you're done with this one, which will also be linked below. If you're interested in how these shinies were originally locked and how I implemented them, keep watching, as that's what the remainder of this video is going to be about. Before we continue, if you're a fan of my content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Lets me know you're enjoying the content and really helps my channel to grow. Our story starts a few days after the Go Pokédex video came out, with me being curious about this game's shiny mechanics. You see, I wasn't entirely convinced that the shinies in this game even existed in the first place. There's almost no footage of them on the internet, aside from a single video of a Hoppip that was already on screen by the time the video started. That isn't an attack on the person who posted that Hoppip video. In fact, I suggest you check that video out with the iCard on screen as well, because it's the only case on YouTube of someone encountering one organically. Something I hope someone else is able to do with my mod. I was just skeptical about it because I couldn't find a post online where someone else claimed to encounter one. And I don't just mean like a video of one, I couldn't find a written post of one claim either. So I decided to just do some research on how this game's shiny encounters work. Using the password Shiny Rose Raid, I started messing with its data in Dolphin Memory Engine until I found the part of the data which determined whether or not it was shiny. Upon finding that, I then applied that to some wild Pokemon who normally can be shiny, which revealed the blinking behavior that was already seen in that Hoppip video. Where this becomes interesting though, is what happened when I applied this to a Pokemon who can't normally be shiny. Interestingly, despite not having the shiny textures, the Pokemon was still blinking as if it was shiny, and on recruitment, the Pokemon had 200 belly as if it was a normal shiny. With this bit of information, I quickly realized that the other Pokemon who can't be shiny in this game are most likely simply shiny locked, as opposed to the ones that can be shiny just having rare extra forms. Next step was to look through the game's monster.md file for any sort of pattern in the data that only applied to the 36 Pokemon who can be shiny. I had a spreadsheet with the format of each Pokemon's data entry, which was made by one of the other people in a previous data mining effort for these games, which made it easier to look for patterns. Sure enough, I found an unlabeled value which was set to 00 for most Pokemon, but in the case of the 36 Pokemon who can be shiny, was set to 01. In order to rule out this being related to their textures, I changed Caterpie's value to 00 and loaded this file into the game instead of the one normally used. Upon changing a Caterpie into a shiny, the textures remained, which indicated that this value was most likely related to the encounters. I'd verify this later, but for now I just set the value on every Pokemon in the off chance that I naturally encountered one during the rest of testing. Of course, one of the most important parts of any given shiny Pokemon was still missing from the picture at this point, and that would be figuring out how to get the right textures to load on the models when shiny. This is when something incredibly interesting happens. I bring in Raikou's shiny textures from Rumble Weekend Edition for the sake of testing, without any sort of changes done to them. Upon loading into the game and changing the Raikou from my playthrough into a shiny, the textures automatically applied to the model. As it turns out, the game will always check if the textures for a particular shiny are present in the game data. If they are present, it will apply them to the model. If they are not present though, the game will just use the regular textures if a shiny appears. The framework for every single missing shiny was already in the game just lacked the files to include them. And as a result of this, the devs shiny locked the majority of the cast. There's a theory that there was a strict file size limit for games on the WiiWare service, and this seems to be another example for that theory of cuts made for that purpose. After reaching out to Absolblog's Pokemon for permission to use his textures from Weekend Edition potentially for this mod, and also extracting the textures from my Pokemon Ranch, I began blindly dumping in large groups of textures at a time with barely any changes, expecting to fine-tune them later on. Here's where one of those technical limitations I mentioned earlier comes in. Unfortunately, it seems that the game will spit out a corruption error if you include more than around 55% of all the shiny textures at the same time. I still don't know how to get around this problem at the moment, so I had to come up with a compromise. If there's anyone who's more familiar with this sort of issue in WiiWare games that might have any suggestions for a fix, let me know. I'd be glad to make an update. I decided that the best compromise for the situation as it is right now would be to only include the shiny textures of the Pokemon who are available in the version you're playing. So say if you had a shiny Charizard you found on Wildfire. It would have its shiny textures when used in Wildfire, but look normal when used in either Tempest or Radiant. Because 75% of all Pokemon in these games are version exclusives, this was enough to include almost every Pokemon in at least one game. There's a couple exceptions to this rule though. Because members of the Eevee line appear in all versions of the game, I decided to let any of them keep their textures in all versions if they didn't cause the other versions to go over the limit, which thankfully they didn't. I also accidentally put Galliot in the wrong folder when I was sorting files, and it ended up in the folder for all games instead of just Radiant. It didn't cause any problems, so I figured rebuilding Wildfire just to remove it when I was testing Tempest and found it by accident was just unnecessary. There might be other cases of me putting Pokemon in that folder without realizing they ended up in all versions, but I did make sure all Pokemon appear in at least the version they were supposed to. So if you have a shiny that was supposed to be version exclusive and it keeps its shiny palette in other games, that'd be why. You might have noticed that I said almost every Pokemon in at least one game and not just all of them. That would be, unfortunately, because I could not figure out how to get Arceus' shiny textures to load on its model. I didn't really consider this a big deal, because as far as I can tell, Arceus isn't affected by the changes I made. I forced Arceus to be shiny during the boss fight, and it didn't stay shiny afterward, so it's likely that the challenge letter gives a predetermined Arceus. Since Arceus' challenge letter is a hosted Wi-Fi mission, that mission would always be the same regardless of how many times you download it. I still want to address the shiny textures eventually, and maybe someday I'll figure something out for the challenge letter Pokemon, and test things such as boss legendaries, the starters, and other mission Pokemon too. But unfortunately, I'm terrible at anything coding related, so I'm not really sure if I'd be able to do much about it. Arceus' boss fight would have been pure torture to shiny hunt anyway, so it's probably doing you a favor by being unobtainable shiny for now. The run on screen you're seeing happened into a stun lock I didn't even plan. But because you can't bring anything but your leader into this dungeon, in order to replicate this, you would need at minimum to recruit a Caterpie that manages to fully evolve, and then levels up enough to learn Sunspore, then spam Astonish with Drifblim, who is one of the best options for this dungeon to use, and you still need to have another Pokemon that can do heavy damage in between so you don't run out of PP. Most Pokemon only do 1 or 2 damage a hit to this thing. Dustox with Bug Bite and a Violent Seed was one of the only exceptions I've ever seen. During the time period of trying to figure out how to get around the texture error without splitting by version, I eventually figured out the best way to verify everything was working properly. I ended up looking for the value that determines when Pokemon will spawn on the floor. Once I found that, I checked what happened when I locked it, and it turned out that despite the value still being the same thing, it happened to still spawn in different random Pokemon every turn. So with that in mind, I locked in the amount of Pokemon beaten on the floor to the maximum value, as to maximize the shiny odds, as that is apparently known to be a factor that can increase shiny odds in these games, and I also locked in my leader's hunger stat to not lower at all, and then hung out inside a wall for a bit. Normally, being inside a wall will eat away a ton of your hunger every turn, so you wouldn't be able to normally hold A and B to pass turns for very long while inside one. This meant I didn't need to deal with massive swarms of Pokemon attacking me and delaying spawning more Pokemon. Because a Pokemon was spawning every turn, this allowed me to find every wild Pokemon slot the game uses, and add an address block to the values that indicated each of those Pokemon could be shiny. This would allow me to check every Pokemon on the floor for being shiny by just looking at Dolphin Memory Engine instead of locating every last Pokemon on the floor, which would be impossible given new ones would be spawning faster than I could defeat them. When I was near the Pokemon cap for the floor, I'd just go to the next floor and start spawning in more Pokemon. Eventually, the first shiny spawned in, and it was a Nidoran female. The issue was, I couldn't actually find this Nidoran in time before it apparently despawned. Whether I just missed it before I left the previous floor, or it just despawned due to the amount of Pokemon that were spawning, I don't know. However, the value indicating that it was shiny had changed to a 0. While it was unfortunate that I didn't see it in-game, I knew that I had then most likely enabled the missing shinies properly. Once I got over the disappointment in missing her, I started spawning in more Pokemon for another half hour or so, until eventually another shiny spawned in. This was another Nidoran female. Since I saw what happened the last time that I didn't turn off the unlimited spawning cheat I made, I turned that off and went looking for this Nidoran. After looking around for a few minutes, I finally found her. The proof that my work wasn't for nothing and that this patch was absolutely working. So what did I do next? I decided to grab some footage of this very special shiny and use it as a teaser for this mod in the video about WiiWare shiny Pokemon. Once the footage was recorded, I decided to recruit this historic shiny into my team before going on to create the WiiWare Shinies video. I'm not usually one who likes keeping hack shinies or anything, but it felt wrong to effectively delete a crucial part of this mod's development history. The rest of the creation process was very straightforward. I finished the sorting of the textures to make sure the right ones go to the right versions, set up each version with the new textures, fix any names that weren't the same between Ranch, Rumble, and Mystery Dungeon so the model loads in with the right textures, and finally checked every single Pokemon in both genders to fix any graphical errors that come from some of the models and textures being slightly different between these games. There were quite a few instances of certain Pokemon initially loading in as graphical vomit, but thankfully, whenever the Ranch textures didn't work, I was usually able to take some textures from Weekend Edition that worked instead. I'd like to take this moment to thank Absol for allowing me to use the textures from Weekend Edition for this project, as this potentially saved me days if not weeks of making custom textures myself. Some of the Pokemon don't use the same textures in Mystery Dungeon as they did in Ranch, making those ones incompatible. Thankfully, in every instance of that happening, the textures from Weekend Edition lined up perfectly. If you're somehow watching this video and have not heard of Absol, I'll link to his channel and his video discussing his findings while making Rumble Weekend Edition below. It's a fascinating watch. I do find it particularly funny that we've gone from Mystery Dungeon's translation project enabling the Gen 2 and 3 Pokemon to be added to Rumble, to now where that same Rumble mod is being used to implement missing shinies into those same Mystery Dungeon games that gave Rumble its Johto and Hoenn Pokemon. I will say there are a few of these Pokemon that I want to change a little bit in the future to make them look a little more accurate or just less bad. For example, Sceptile looks significantly darker in this hack than it does in any of the main series games, which is weird because Trico and Grovyle look perfectly fine. While I would have just tried the other set of textures in that instance, Sceptile was one of the ones who only had proper textures in Weekend Edition, and for whatever reason they came out a bit darker than I'd have preferred when used in Mystery Dungeon. Crawdon also doesn't look orange enough, for example, but for now, this mod is functional and the majority of the cast look great. If you decide to give this mod a try, please send me a tweet at NeoSalted if you happen to encounter any of the new shinies. I'd love to see these games finally get some recognition, and also what shinies people go and hunt now that they're all here. Personally, I might go and hunt Kecleon myself at some point. It seems like it would be one of the easiest hunts to complete since you encounter so many of them at a time and you can just camp out in the walls with a mobile scarf or a ghost type at the bottom of your stack to avoid any damage. I hear that despite not being exclusive to Radiant, there might be something special if you happen to use a shiny one in that version. Before we go, I of course also need to shout out the people behind the original WiiWare translation project, as the mod I've created is built on top of that, and also the tools created during that project were vital to any research I've done in these games. And of course, as always, thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. It means the world to me that so many people are enjoying my content. Later on, Buzz. Take care.